They started out as whirlybirds, egg beaters, and the early versions looked frail. But the helicopter has evolved into a marvelous piece of machinery, indispensable in so many industries. Even Leonardo da Vinci, who first proposed and sketched the concept of rotor flight 500 years ago, couldn't have imagined the fantastic variety of uses for what he called the helical screw. The first practical helicopter didn't fly until 1937, and they didn't become widely used until the late 1950s, when the introduction of gas turbines meant smaller, lighter engines and a much larger load capacity. Since those days, several new designs have emerged, capable of carrying more people and greater loads over longer distances. But the basic principles of rotor flight, first theorized by da Vinci, still apply to all helicopters. As helicopters become more common and their uses more varied, it's important to know that these machines are also better built, safer to fly, and the pilots are better trained than ever before. For the passenger inside, a flight in a helicopter is much like a flight in any other aircraft. But of course, because passengers often enter and exit helicopters while the machines are running, the safety considerations are often quite different. Even though you may have ridden in a helicopter before, spend a few minutes with us on some key points of safety for helicopter passengers. We'll review proper entry and exit procedures, how to safely store equipment on board, ground safety around the landing and takeoff area, proper use of seat belts and the intercom, and what to do in the event of an emergency. This information will help to make your flight safe and enjoyable. Your pilot is also an important source of information. A pre-flight briefing is mandatory. Listen carefully to what your pilot tells you.
Which of course is very dangerous. It could get sucked into the rotors or the engine as well.
Because they are designed to hover rather than glide, helicopters fill a different role than a fixed-wing aircraft. In fact, the rotor blades on a helicopter actually have more in common with the wings of an airplane than with the propeller. Each rotor blade is shaped like a wing and generates its lifting power the same way, by air flowing over them at high speed. Instead of being pulled through the air, though, helicopters fly by rotating their blades, forcing air downward. Passengers who are directing the pilot to perform a specific task or to land in a certain area should keep in mind that it generally takes 2 hands to fly a helicopter. Don't expect the pilot to point to things, and don't ask questions that will require the pilot to use hand gestures. The very reasons a helicopter flies and moves, the main rotor and the tail rotor, are the most important safety considerations when entering or leaving a machine. A simple rule of thumb to avoid the tail rotor is always stay within the pilot's field of vision. That's the area from the doors forward. Keep well forward and away from the dangerous tail rotor, which all but disappears when it's spinning. When boarding, wait for the pilot's signal to approach the aircraft and walk around the front of the helicopter to get to the other side. Never duck under the tail boom. It should also be remembered that the main rotor blades can sag or droop, often due to a gust of wind, and you must duck or crouch slightly while approaching or leaving the helicopter. Keep your eye on where you're heading, not on the ground. If the ground is uneven, always approach and leave the helicopter on the downslope side. For the same reason, equipment or other gear carried near the helicopter should always be held at or below waist level, so it remains well below the main rotor. Never carry equipment, skis, or anything else on your shoulder. And don't wave. Gear should be stored carefully so it can't shift during flight, and when unloading, don't throw material off the aircraft. It could get thrown into the rotor. Inside the cabin of the helicopter, nothing must block the doors. Door latches on helicopters don't automatically lock. You must ensure they are properly closed. Normally, the pilot will direct loading, unloading, and closing of doors. But remember, you have the right to ask, and the pilot has the responsibility to show you these procedures. Hats and loose articles of clothing should be held firmly when entering and exiting a helicopter. Or if your hands are occupied, they should be strapped down. Bring along footwear that's appropriate for the task at hand. Wear warm enough clothing to cope with any weather, and take along essential medication in case of delays. It's also important to avoid touching the helicopter's antenna and glass bubble while moving around outside the machine, and to avoid touching switches and controls inside the cabin. Helicopter seatbelts are the same design as those in other aircraft. Make sure yours is fastened securely and snugly, and don't remove it until the pilot signals that it's all right to do so. If shoulder harnesses are available, use them. It's also wise to fasten all seatbelts, even those not actually in use, to prevent them from hanging out the door and damaging the aircraft. The noise generated by a helicopter makes communication difficult. Normally, an intercom is used to speak to the pilot and other passengers. Most intercoms require passengers to push a button to talk. It's important to limit conversation to matters concerning the flight and never speak to the pilot during takeoff and landing, unless it's to warn of an emergency. The pilot must concentrate on flying the machine at these critical times and may be communicating with air traffic control personnel. Chatter on the intercom can be distracting and may result in a missed instruction from the controllers. And when the pilot is speaking, he can't hear the passengers anyway, so wait until you're into the flight before talking. When you're around a helicopter landing pad, note the wind direction. Like other aircraft, helicopters approach into the wind. Knowing the wind direction will allow you to position yourself safely as helicopters take off and land. The wind generated by the helicopter's main rotor is known as downwash, or simply wash. The larger the helicopter, the greater the wash. So it's important to keep landing areas clear of items that might be blown around by the downwash. There are two reasons. The flying debris can cause injury to those on the ground, and it could be blown into the blades or sucked into the turbines of the helicopter. The force of the wind generated by a helicopter landing or taking off can also slam shut nearby doors and windows. Be aware of anything near the helipad that's light enough to be moved by the wash and secure it, whether it's a piece of plywood or an innocent-looking plastic garbage bag. Loose plastic is deadly to the safe operation of a helicopter. Helicopters are reliable and safe machines, but occasionally, mechanical problems could force an emergency landing. Similarly, poor weather or other circumstances may require the pilot to land the machine as a precaution. It's important to know what you can do to help yourself and others in these situations. The first thing to do before ever getting into the helicopter is to be sure your clothing is adequate for any conditions you might encounter, including footwear suitable for the job you're doing. Of course, you can and should ask the pilot to point out the location of the following equipment. First, note where emergency equipment, first aid kit, and fire extinguishers are located. Note the exit doors and how to operate them. Also learn where the emergency locator transmitter is, as well as the life raft if one is on board. The pilot can show you, or you'll find it on your cabin safety card. A few seconds spent on these matters now may save your life in the event of an emergency landing. Despite its appearance, a helicopter can be very stable and controllable during emergency landings. If the engines were to fail on a helicopter while the machine is airborne, the pilot still has a great deal of control through a process called auto-rotation. As the helicopter descends, the air rushing upwards spins the rotor blades, just the same as if the engine were still working. Thus, the pilot can still control the helicopter and land it safely, even without engine power. So an emergency landing is often a very safe landing. Still, in an emergency situation, listen carefully to the pilot's instructions. Tighten your seatbelt, remove your necktie, and loosen your collar. Also remove eyeglasses and put them in your pocket. If you're using only a lap belt, assume the brace position when told to by the pilot and wait for his or her okay before leaving the craft. If you're strapped in with a shoulder harness, sit up straight in the seat with the harness pulled snug. Keep your knees together and fold your arms across your chest. After landing, wait for all movement to stop before exiting. And don't panic. Help is already on the way. If you'll be flying over water, know where the life raft is stored, but wait until you're well clear of the downed craft before inflating it. To help rescue personnel to find you, try to remember to take the emergency locator transmitter along. The ELT sends out a homing signal for emergency response teams. Know where it's stored before the helicopter takes off. You can help yourself avoid emergency situations by realizing that the pilot always has the final say on whether to fly. It is the pilot's responsibility to assess weather conditions, weight, and other concerns. Don't pressure a pilot to fly if he or she advises against it. During longer flights, your helicopter may need to be refueled. During the procedure, passengers and other non-essential personnel must leave the helicopter. No smoking is allowed within 20 meters of the helicopter at any time, and especially during refueling. Helicopters perform many specialized functions. However, unless you're trained to work on these specialized flights, you won't be allowed to go along. You would only be exposing yourself to unnecessary danger. During procedures like prescribed burning, aerial fertilization, and helicopter logging, the pilot is even busier than normal and wouldn't have time to instruct or supervise untrained personnel. Be selfish about your safety and reduce your own risk. Don't go along for the ride on working flights unless you have an actual job to perform. Now let's review the safety points covered so far. Your pilot is the final authority on safety procedures while you're in or around a helicopter. If you have questions about safety, ask. When approaching or departing a helicopter, always crouch slightly to stay well below the main rotor. Stay around the front of the aircraft. Never walk to the rear of a helicopter. Hold equipment and other gear at or below waist level and ensure it's properly loaded and secured. Clear the landing and takeoff area of all loose debris. Inside the cabin, do not place anything in front of the doors. Keep chatter on the intercom to a minimum. Pull your seatbelt snug during the flight and use the shoulder belts when they're available. Note the location of all emergency equipment before you leave the ground, and be sure to take adequate clothing and any essential medication in case the return trip is delayed. This completes the review of basic helicopter safety procedures. Now, let's look at more specialized helicopter flights. The doors on helicopters are sometimes removed for specific types of flights. For instance, the doors are taken off so photographers can get better pictures while in flight, or to give better coverage for infrared scanning equipment. When flying in a helicopter with the doors removed, passengers must wear their seatbelts and, when available, shoulder belts. Personnel operating equipment out the open door should wear properly secured harnesses as well as their seatbelts. The pilot will check to ensure passengers are properly secured. All loose objects in the cabin must be stored to prevent them from being blown around, and never throw anything out the open doors. Arms and legs must be kept inside. For door-off flight, passengers should also be properly dressed. The cabin is completely open to the elements, and wind chill is exaggerated by the flying speed. Slinging simply means the helicopter carries a load underneath the aircraft. There are virtually no circumstances where passengers are allowed on board the helicopter during slinging operations, and untrained personnel are not permitted to prepare or attach slings to the helicopter. If you need to be on the ground nearby a slinging operation, keep clear of the load at all times, and never turn your back on the load once the helicopter is hooked up to it. If you are going to remain close to the operation, wear goggles, gloves, hearing protection, a hard hat with chin strap, and highly visible clothing. Do not signal the helicopter from the ground unless you are trained to do so. Untrained personnel will not be required to leave the helicopter while it is still off the ground. Only specifically trained people, like heli attack personnel, who must sometimes set down in difficult terrain, will leave the aircraft while it is still in the air. These so-called hover exits occur when there's no level ground where the pilot can land, or if speed of exit is important. Even the most temporary helicopter landing pads must meet certain minimum standards to ensure safe landing and takeoff. A large area around the helipad must be clear to the ground, with no standing timber, snags, or overhead hazards like loose rocks on a hillside. In any case, the pilot is responsible for identifying a suitable landing site. Normally, you will not be involved in building a helipad. If you ever are required to help in construction of a helipad, training will be provided. Don't try to clear a landing pad or identify approach and departure paths without thorough training in the procedures. Along with solid and safe landing areas, helicopters also need approach paths that consider such factors as prevailing wind direction, aircraft weight and expected loads, altitude and temperature. A safe flight path also steers away from potential flight hazards like power lines, tall trees, fueling areas, and work areas. It's important to consider these factors and any others that apply to your site so as not to overestimate the mechanical capabilities of the helicopter. An unloaded helicopter is more agile and reaches altitude much faster than one carrying a heavy load. An empty helicopter on a perfect day will easily clear a nearby stand of tall trees. Once loaded, however, or faced with difficult altitude, wind, or temperature conditions, the helicopter may not be able to clear the trees. As a passenger, if you're ferried to an area by helicopter, don't leave that area and expect the pilot to be able to find you unless you have thoroughly discussed it beforehand. The panoramic view from a helicopter works against you when you're a tiny figure on the ground. Plus, the new landing site to which you have moved may be unsafe for any one of a dozen reasons. Remember, this safety information is intended to make your helicopter flight safe and enjoyable. Please apply the information in this program to all your future flights. If you had difficulty with any of the preceding safety points, you're encouraged to review them or discuss them with your pilot.